Buonasera amici di GiovedìScienza,
Good
benvenuti a
evening,
questo nostro
friends of GiovedìScienza, Science on a Thursday. Welcome to the second meeting of the 28th season, and I would also like to welcome all those who are following us from home and the ones who are following us from Venice, from the Telecom Center in Venice, who will also be asking questions if they so wish. This evening's speaker is Professor Maria Caramelli. Maria Caramelli, good evening. Is well known on television too, because very often she is on to answer questions on health and food safety. And she was in charge of the BSE emergency, the one which was called in the papers the mad cow disease, and she was in charge for Italy. And it is thanks to the checks that were carried out, very, very careful, very serious and in-depth in Italy. We virtually were not touched by BSE, which in fact affected the UK and other countries. We will be talking about health, food and safety with Professor Caramelli, who's also a member of the health services for the country and is the director of the Veterinary Medical Research Institute of Turin. It's a very important institute. It's in charge for Piedmont, Liguria and the D'Aosta Valley. To talk about health and food and safety while we are coming closer to the World Expo in Milan. As you know, the theme of the World Expo is food, how to feed the world. Because let us not forget that in the year 2050 we will be 9 billion. We're now 7-point-something billion. And if we look at food, it means that we have looking at the future of human beings, both in terms of safety, which is the main topic of this evening, but also in terms of having the enough food for everyone. We know that there's enough food because we're producing food for 12 billion people, but we know that this food is not well distributed and wealth is not well distributed, and not everybody has equal access to food. There's about 1 billion people who are overweight and who are eating more calories or intaking more calories than they need to, but there's about another billion, possibly more, of people who are undernourished and in particular in many cases have not access to drinking water. So food and water are one of the key points for our future. One more thing, about 70% of new and emerging diseases are of animal origin, and in the US, which is not a country that has the problems of underdevelopment, but there are 9,000 people a year who die because of diseases that are transmitted through food. Maria Caramelli, who is now going to get the floor to, has also discussed in a book called Not to Discover It Eating. It's published by Instar, and you'll find it outside, and Professor Caramelli, if you so wish, will sign your copy. And this book summarizes all the problems that they've been and all the alarms on food and gives us ideas and advice on future. And in particular, we'll see how things are changing. For example, now there's a fashion and raw food is coming up, and very often people think that raw food is healthy food, but this is not always true. In some cases, it's absolutely not true, and in other cases, and Professor Caramelli will be dealing with the topic of how you inform the public of health and food risks, because one is always wavering in between overreacting and underreacting, faced with the dangers that we have sometimes lurking on our tables. Thank you, Professor Caramelli. Thank you. I would like to begin by referring to something which has to do with Italy's scientific culture. Scientific culture has been declining, in particular in the past 2 years. The average scientific knowledge is dropping. You know that one of the Lisbon objectives of the European Union is to increase average scientific culture to make them more aware, more protected, more aware of the decisions that affect them. And Italy is sliding down the scale in a dramatic manner. So my thank you this evening to Piero Bianucci, to Pino Zappala, and to all the organization is not just for having invited me and for making it possible for me to introduce the Veterinary Medical Research Institute, but thank you very much for the battle that you're carrying out to spread scientific culture. If we continue like this, it'll get worse. This is one of the indicators that's not working well in our country, and that is, in fact, leading us to be more distant from advanced countries. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce the Veterinary Medical Research Institute. We've had it here in Turin for 100 years, and as very often happens for Turin, the city has pioneered this institute. And 100 years ago, when they conceived the Veterinary Institute, they built it in 2 months, and it's still the same place we're in. And 100 years ago, they were thinking of the importance of the impact that animal diseases could have on humans and on the economy. So before bird flu, before BSE, Turin had understood that an institute was necessary. Other cities have now copied it. As we can say, how many people work there? 450 for the 3 regions, 250 for Piedmont, but at 450 for that. 70% of us are women. So it's a job where women, I'm convinced, are very good, because I feel that the sense of collective responsibility that women have helps in defending our table. Now, we celebrated our 100th anniversary, and you can see how every time you eat, you buy something, you are completing the path that was started out by the Veterinary Institute. Sometimes it's a very long and winding road that leads to our table, with a lot of activities leading to it. An institute like ours depends on the Ministry of Health. We come under the Ministry of Health. And there are 10 such institutes in Italy. Some cover 1 region, some cover 2 or 3 or 4 regions. And our work is prevention. We don't cure anyone, but we carry out prevention. And by preventing the disease, as Bianucci was saying, are mostly linked to animals. And thanks to the work that we're doing, we try to reduce the costs for the health service. A country like Italy, who loves people who come after emergencies rather than people who prevent, it's quite difficult to explain the importance of prevention. But we must do it. This is what we have to do. Now, today I shall be talking about 2 main points. One is the fight against animal diseases, in other words, defending animal and well-being of animals, and the other one is health, food and health issues, and more specifically, clearly they intertwined, but they're not exactly the same thing. Animal diseases are spread everywhere, and very often they cause infectious diseases, new ones. For example, SARS, Ebola, bird flu, or BSE, others. There are a number of diseases that we've had to the mad cow disease, as I was saying, dioxin, blue mozzarellas, and the latest ones, which I will be talking about in a moment. But we see that most of the diseases that have affected, the new diseases that have affected human beings in the past few years, are linked to animals or to animals used as food. There is a number of reasons. One is a slightly overused word, which is globalization. Globalization of food, but also the globalization of people and animals and things. What do I mean by things? I think of raw materials, think of fodder, and think of Italy imports, for example, foodstuff for animals. So they come from various parts of the globe. This is a challenge, And the big challenge is how to monitor the raw materials or the plants that come in and that may be carrying diseases. Animals are also moved. Think about how people move nowadays. There's been a big migration flow, but animals are moved 5 times as often as human beings, or there are 5 times more animals, and you can see that this means that they're going to spread diseases. Now look at this. Look at the emerging infective diseases throughout the world. Interestingly, they're concentrated in the most developed areas of the world, the most industrialized area. Of course, we know that there are people, better monitoring systems in the developed countries, but that notwithstanding, we know that the biggest concentration of diseases are in Europe and in the US. As said, they are linked to animals. Now, this means that a disease, which is a threat, in a very faraway place in our globe, it can become a threat for ourselves. Think of the bird flu disease. A matter of a few hours, with an aeroplane, a disease which was in a very faraway distant country becomes a danger for us. And in the past 20 years, we have witnessed this enormous change for these challenges. When the mad cow disease arrived 20 years ago, Rome would say, oh, don't worry, it's in the UK. We now know that things have changed. We know that animal diseases and the food chain do not stay within a country's boundaries. They have no barriers and can reach us with no difficulty at all. Another reason is global warming, that is to say, changes in our weather patterns. In fact, the changes in global warming, and we know this because we've studied this, and we carried out also studied the diseases that are borne by vectors such as mosquitoes or fleas that have increased because in both our domestic and wild animals they thrive, and from the animals they go to human beings. There were diseases that did not exist in our countries in the past because the insects didn't survive. So, for example, the Northern Nile encephalitis, the name itself tells us that it's a dangerous disease, but it was in North Africa. Generally, it's in the summer, and this started now in Italy and throughout southern Europe, and it's borne by mosquitoes that are not typical of our latitudes. Our colleagues who are monitoring the ports, there are ships, they open the containers and they've got grains there, and they have lots and lots of mosquitoes, vital mosquitoes that have time to replicate, to lay their eggs, and that are now warmer temperatures, warmer than a few years ago, find the opportunity to replicate. For example, we also monitor the mosquitoes which are the so-called zoonosis in Piedmont, and we find Korean mosquitoes, Egyptian mosquitoes, apart from the famous tiger mosquito. But we find species of insects that a few years ago were unthinkable. It was unthinkable that we would find it. This means that we're also getting the diseases. This is the reason why veterinary surgeons and medical doctors have to work together, because very often these diseases that are hosted by animals are better known by veterinary surgeons. For example, they're birds like crows or ravens, and the horse that will carry the encephalitis of the Northern Nile. In the US, too, it spread, for example, amongst the crows of Central Park and killed a few people. This is just to give you an idea how the changes in our climate can change the impact or the number of diseases affecting us. What have we got here? Well, here I've got a few facts and figures just to show you what is happening. Well, the first thing that we do is that we monitor these animal diseases, and if there is an outbreak, you have to be very careful and follow them. In the 50s and 60s, don't forget we have 100 years of data, we used to work on major diseases that in the 50s and 60s were fatal. For example, TB, brucellosis, and here you can see these are the most important ones that we follow. There's bird flu, blue tongue, and others, and they're very often not transmittable to human beings, but we also know that they're coming back and that these are re-emerging diseases. So it's essential to check these problems. And there's another reason, and that is to say that we have to defend the animals of our regions because this is our wealth. We have over 900,000 cattle in Piedmont, 3 million pigs. We have a large number of birds that we use on our tables. We certainly produce all the chickens we need, but we import a lot of other animals. It's a very precious treasure. We have to look after it from an economic point of view, too. And the fact that we monitor it, it means that we can block the outbreak and that we can guarantee the fact that we're exporting healthy animals and healthy livestock in general. But as I was saying, we had tuberculosis, brucellosis. We monitor large numbers. And here you can see the ones which are dangerous for human beings. But currently, in the past few years, we have had to face a number of emergencies. That is to say, suddenly, instead of having illnesses we've known for tens of years, if not hundreds, and that we've virtually eliminated, but unfortunately southern Italy brucellosis, which is transmitted to human beings through milk, still exists, although in limited number. And brucellosis can be rekindled. There might be a new outbreak. It goes both ways. So not only human beings are at risk for TB, but our animals, vice versa, can pick up tuberculosis from human beings. The big battle now, though, is to do with the emergency outbreaks. The mad cow is a case in point. It was very important because BSE made it possible for us to understand that its food stuff has to be as healthy as the food stuff that we eat. What did BSE do? Why was it emerged? Because we have made cows cannibals through the food stuff which was made of ground bone and meat. We have amplified a prion, which is a protein which resists or used to resist at high temperatures, which means that by continuously recycling carcasses or the leftovers, what you were being refed to animals, made it more resistant. This is a rather unusual idea because on the one hand, by recycling carcasses, you avoid the problem of having to dispose of them, which is also an environmental problem. But we're asking the cows to hyperproduce milk because cows now produce much more milk than they would naturally, but you give them a protein bomb, and you give them animal proteins instead of plant proteins. So the idea of using the leftovers after the slaughter to nourish the cows with themselves was not per se a crazy idea. But we didn't think that this might become a medium or a vector for illnesses. In the UK, there was a new disease and the cows became mad, and they became very aggressive, and this disease was transmitted to human beings because it's a neurodegenerative disease. It made people mad too, and in fact, youngsters, 270 victims in the UK, and it was a very long and devastating disease. And what was unacceptable, and here we're talking about communication and science, was that the possibility that mad cow disease could be transmitted, and there's a trial that was held in the UK, was not revealed to people for years because it was concealed because they didn't want to generate panic No, they didn't want to damage the meat industry. The other thing that we learned is that if we hide things and we take on a sort of patronizing, concealing attitude to avoid alarm, well, we can cause bigger damage by concealing the information than by releasing the information. Turin was appointed as the center. I had gone to the UK. In Italy, everybody was convinced the mad cow disease would not arrive, but otherwise we wouldn't have been coordinators, because if they'd understood it was such an important disease, they wouldn't have put a woman to chair it. But they did. They didn't understand it, and I set up a laboratory in Turin. So when in 2000, 2001, the panic station broke out, Turin was the coordinating body. The number that you can see here is a very large number, and it has to do with the 850,000 tests. It's a very large number, and it has to do with only the 3 regions that I was referring to, Piedmont, Liguria, and the Aosta Valley. And what happened was that because we had very stringent measures and a lot of checks in Italy, we were the country that had the smallest number of human victims, but also the smallest number of cases and outbreaks of the disease amongst the cattle. We also have an enormous damage economically, because Italy pays enormous sums of money for damage in this sector for diseases that come from other countries. So the large crisis, and I will show you very rapidly the history, come from other countries for a number of reasons, only that we very often pay the consequences of it in financial terms and social problems and fear. For instance, let us take bird flu. I put 2013 because it's a problem that we still have in Italy, in the sense that right up to this summer we've had small outbreaks, and we have been able to contain it in areas, very limited areas. We haven't had it in Piedmont, but in Emilia-Romagna. There was a strain of bird flu that was very aggressive. This is transmitted to human beings, but it is not transmitted through the eggs or meat. This is very important to remember, because it's a pity when there have been these alarms, which you're quite right to abandon or discontinue eating eggs and chicken. Contagion happens through contact with the animal. In fact, this summer there were 20 people who had this, and they, of course, recovered completely because they were handling these animals. In fact, the only person who died in Europe was a veterinary surgeon who was handling the affected birds. So the risk is linked to contagious. It's not a disease which is transmitted through eating. When we go to Southeast Asia, where there are children who are constantly with pigs or with birds, because there's also swine disease, and that there is not good hygiene and dirt, alongside with the fact that in those countries, for example, wild duck blood pudding, black pudding, is very often considered a delicacy. Then you do have transmission, but this is not, for example, comparable to the biosecurity of our chicken farms. When there is an outbreak like this, immediately there are measures are implemented so the disease doesn't spread, because in any case, in the case, for example, of a flu disease, it's a virus that can mutate very easily and can become very aggressive for human beings. So it's essential to contain it. Between August and September, we've had this alarm. Everything was blocked until we had completed controls and monitors. So we were sort of an accident or emergency or an ER center for it. Sometimes we have other diseases that are not dangerous for human beings, which is like the blue tongue disease. You see that there's the sheep who get lesions, but the damage is enormous for the economy. So we then implement monitoring plans. The other thing that I'm saying is very important, and that is to say the control on the final product. For example, we check out most foodstuff. What do we do? Well, the veterinary services, jointly with the region and the institute, the Veterinary Medical Research Institute, on the basis of national and European guidelines, carry out sampling of the entire food chain. For example, if you're going to have a slice of roast beef, before being monitored or checked as a slice of roast beef, the cattle has been checked, what it eats has been checked, and then clearly we are the last link of the chain, and we represent a very important part. Now, these controls and these sampling are very important, and we then carry out epidemiological studies, seeing how and where the next checks have to be carried out. As you see, most types of food are covered. Italians are really worried about it. According to a European survey, the most concerned are the Italians and the Portuguese. In spite of the fact that there are a large number of checks, we carry out more checks on foodstuff than all the other European countries put together. And there are fines, which are not small fines, that go with it. So there's really very strong and in-depth monitoring. But prevention is not just monitoring. Monitoring is repression. And what we must have as prevention is a culture which forewarns us. I'm thinking of problems such as chemical contamination. We have to have a culture to defend the environment, because all the things that are in the environment, in the end, will enter the food chain. What do we see? Well, if we want to see it negatively, we have 2% of all our foodstuff. These are the monitoring and checks in Piedmont. So we see that there are 2% that have something that's wrong with them. But this means that 98% of what we eat is safe and healthy. That 2%, though, you find things that are not good, and really nothing to joke about. There's Campylobacter, Salmonella, Listeria, especially amongst the microbiological agents, and then heavy metals and all the others. Salmonella is the best known. It's always been the most widespread in Europe. There are more than 1,000 types of Salmonella, and now there's the Campylobacter that has taken the first prize in Europe. It prefers a temperature of about 40, 41 degrees centigrade, so it loves chicken because live chickens are warmer or have a higher body temperature than mammals. We haven't got as many Campylobacter findings as the rest of Europe. Why? Because in Italy this is still, I think, not enough work done on transmissible diseases. We talk about 30,000 cases a year, but I'm sure about that's underestimating it. I think there's still a system that has to be implemented, links between doctors and veterinary surgeons, so that we can monitor the exact number of cases. In most cases, it's only gastroenteritis, stomach bug. Maybe you have temperature and you think that you have flu, but you don't have any flu. I think that most of the cases, if you have those symptoms, are due to Campylobacter. And for example, so you don't certainly go to a hospital for it, so you don't get the total number. But I think that the total number of diseases transmitted through foodstuff are underestimated, and there are it's an enormous cost. And epidemiological data say that they increase by 8% every year for reasons such as globalization, the globalization of the food chain. There's a longer and longer food chain before it reaches our table. The foodstuff has to go through number of different stopovers every 100 or so kilometers. Much harder to monitor that type of food chain. Listeria, let's take the listeria. You find it everywhere, in the salads, in a sandwich, wherever, in the fish, or it's a bacterium that is particularly dangerous for elderly people and for pregnant women. It goes through the intestinal barrier, the fetus, the blood-brain barrier, all the barriers. It can even cause encephalitis. What are the systems to fight these bacteria? Well, you have to cook it. Careful cooking in itself will destroy them, which is why I mentioned that it had been made by Bianucci on the risks, in the sense that we have to be aware of what we're cooking. Human beings have always known that even when they weren't really knowledgeable about it, but primitive human beings knew that by cooking they reduced the potential of food harming them. They didn't know why, what. We've always used fermentation, smoking, cooking. These are all systems to make food safer. By cooking it, we have no risk as far as these bacteria are concerned, not for the chemical contamination, which is a completely different matter. Cooking and hygiene, great hygiene, are the two weapons that we have. I will be talking about the E. coli a bit later, but I would like to mention mycotoxins that have been produced by fungi that have a variable effect, and it doesn't give you, for example, stomachache after 3 days, but causes a more severe pathology, for example, the ones that cause a carcinoma of the liver after years. So all these toxins, these chemical contamination is a more distant, more difficult to solve pathology. The impact is over time, and it is very difficult to identify very clearly the source of this contamination. Heavy metals, well, we've heard the problem about the accumulation of heavy metals in the soil, and then dioxins that are the unwelcome products of combustion, whether human beings, whether there's traffic, whether it's a form of combustion, an incinerator or an industrial plant. So everywhere there's a production of dioxin, and dioxin arrives into the food intact, and it is accumulated. And then we have emergencies. Well, emergencies, just to tell you the story that we had this year. There's an epidemic of hepatitis A in Italy. Apparently it was numbers were shrinking, but this is not so. In Italy we have over 1,000 cases because hepatitis A is always there. You know, it's to do with clams, for example. But there are 1,000 cases more than expected in our country, which are probably linked to the frozen raspberries and berries, not from Italy, but from Eastern Europe. But once again, we have an example of disease which is transmitted via foodstuff due to a long food chain. Without saying that the 0-mile chain is perfect, but we should know that if the myrtles in fact, it wasn't the myrtles, it was the mixed. It was in particular the red myrtle. But if the risk is in the frozen berries, if these are gathered in Eastern Europe, packaged, well, then they're frozen in another country, and they come to Italy in packages, and then cases in France too, and the rest of Europe. Clearly, one of the risks due to the very complex and long food chain is present. I realized this summer how we import a lot of these berries. I'm surprised, but 70%, 70% of all these berries in Italy come from other countries, in particular from North Africa. I mean, it's very surprising, and from Eastern Europe. And it's a virus that is survives freezing. So by freezing it, in fact, we're keeping it in very good condition, but is very frail when it is cooked, because now the health ministry, faced with the risk, has officially said, beware if you have frozen berries, before using it, boil it. You must boil it for 2 minutes, and the virus is eliminated. Most of the cases of hepatitis A due to berries in Italy is due to the use of them, especially at restaurants, on cakes, cheesecakes, and so on and so forth, or when they're used as decorations. There is no risk if you buy them fresh at the market. There's this, certainly. There's a special plan for berries, but if there's an emergency, then you immediately implement an emergency plan with extra monitoring and extra testing and sampling. The other type of emergency that we have is the E. coli. There are some particularly aggressive strains. E. coli is a bacterium that is in our gut and in animal guts, but can develop particularly aggressive strains, which have various numbers, 104, 154, and they may cause a serious damage to health. It may harm your health. In the past few years, there have been major E. coli infections, which is why we have introduced special sampling, checking the various foodstuff, because raw foodstuff is good, is tasty, ancient flavors, but it is not protected as much as the other one, because we haven't boiled it or heated it or cooked it, which destroys a lot of the microorganisms. Say raw meat. I don't know if you've seen there's milk. If you saw in the pictures, we have a distribution of unpasteurized raw milk, which comes from the company. Well, we have to monitor that to identify the presence of bacteria, both at distribution and also of the dairy farm. You have to monitor the cattle and other animals, because you have to defend the animals' health as a means to defend our own. This is a Spanish member of the European Parliament, MEP, who is complaining. I call it the killer cucumber, but it's not like that. 3 years ago, we've had the biggest disaster in the center of the most developed part of Europe, northern Germany. Talking about especially women and youngsters, started to die of a disease called SEU, which gives kidney problems, but as well as having all these deaths in a matter of a few days. Over 3,000 people were affected by it, 3,000 people who now need dialysis suddenly, which really sent the health system, because you can realize what it means to suddenly have 3,000 people who need dialysis. They immediately understood that it came from foodstuff, but they were unable to identify the particular thing that had caused it and what it was that had caused the disease. The bacteria was an E. coli 104. I mentioned it earlier on. It's a stomach bug of cattle, which spreads through manure. So clearly, it was obvious that some of the diseased cattle's manure had been used, and this was particularly aggressive and had killed a number of people. They discovered that suddenly that it was the cucumbers, and they said it was Spanish cucumbers. These were organic biological cucumbers. In Germany, they like a lot of cucumbers. Drastic decrease in the number of cucumbers being ate. At the time, they did samples, and we were monitoring Dutch, Spanish cucumbers, all sorts of cucumbers, but in particular, Spain had a problem because I think 17,000 people lost their jobs in a matter of few days because they were the cucumber farmers, and Germany blocked and Putin in Russia blocked both the cucumbers and the gherkins and said that he didn't want people to be poisoned by Spanish cucumbers and also the gherkins. But then they discovered that they were soybeans that came from Egypt via Greece. So it was something which came from Egypt, was sent to Germany. They were bean shoots, soybean shoots, and here the MEP, the Spanish one, spoke about the economic damage or impact that an alarm can have. This is why, and the defense of what is our food heritage is just as important. Food is one of the hallmarks of Italy, and food exports have increased it, and we've got a treasure that all the world envies. A few days ago, Mr. Farinetti said Italy are 0.08% of all the world population, but all the other people in the world would like to eat like Italians. That is to say, we have an extraordinary brand, which is also the theme of the expo, and health safety is a sine qua non. If we can't guarantee health and safety of foodstuff, we won't be able to defend a product which all the world envies us. So they say, you use food with love. Yes, it's true, and no one else does it, and no one can imitate that extraordinary ability that we have. 32 billion exports, worth of exports of foodstuff. We have companies in Piedmont that prepare Piedmontese foodstuff, that they are employing people, and for example, they sell to Russians, say. It's a very precious treasure. It's a treasure that we have to defend. In Italy, we never had the bacterium, but people for 1 month didn't eat cucumber and also zucchini and other vegetables, for example, watermelon and others. I'm talking about the summer 3 years ago, weren't eating because consumers, when they see that there is one particular type of foodstuff that is listed as dangerous, then they immediately stop eating it. So think of the impact that this has on the food industry and the farming industry. 13% of these will never go back to eating it. So, for example, a crisis such as this are a crisis of trust. They undermine the trust in the scientific community and in institutions, not only the trust, the worry of being protected, but also being informed, the fear of not having the information. So I've shown you here something, a fridge with a bit of advice. So we're the last link of the chain, but we as consumers are a very important link, and we can do something for a lot of the things. Because consumers can't do a lot, but they have to trust what other people are doing. But there's something that we can do. There are a lot of diseases that are transmitted or borne by food and are a matter of hygiene. For example, the fridge. A fridge is an extraordinary system, but it has to be used as if it were a lab instrument. Recently, a study showed that the average temperature at most Italian families or households are too warm. They're 7 or 8 degrees instead of 4 degrees. So without over-freezing it, but I think if we keep the food at a temperature which exceeds the temperature which blocks the multiplication of bacteria, clearly we are more exposed to risks. We have to avoid contamination between foods. We must not keep the cooked and raw food stuff together. We must separate meat from vegetable. We must keep the fridge clean. We should never have too much food in the fridge because there should be more air circulating in the fridge. And we should also be careful and check the expiry date because there's a bit of fashion now because they say that an expiry date is an expiry date is an indication to the consumer, which basically has to be respected. Here you see raw milk. Raw milk is a very important topic in Italy. There's a law that says that raw milk can be sold, but it has to be boiled before using it. Well, of course, it means that the flavor, the taste, but this is the law. And one of the reasons is that there have been too many cases in Italy of that syndrome, which I mentioned before. That is to say, the hemolytic ureic syndrome, the same one of the cucumber caused or born by E. coli. Small children react to this bacterium. After 3 or 4, 5, you become much stronger and nothing much happens. But in the small children, this disease, which very often is mentioned in scientific literature and is found in raw milk, may be fatal. This is a law. It's a bit of a problem, but we have to do it. If it says that you have to boil raw milk, you have to boil it. And it must not be, in fact, used in hospitals and in schools. We have about a quarter of an hour left. Another thing which people are very much concerned with are fraud. The Italians are more concerned with food fraud, health frauds, than with tax or financial frauds. And this one is a chapter which is increasing. It has increased, although we have become more skilled in identifying them. The most frequent one is to do with fish, because if we talk about fraud, it also means which is replacing, for example, one species with the other. If I say it's one type of fish and in fact it's another one, that's doesn't harm your health, but it's a fraud. And so fish is the most frequently. Sometimes it's not even something that they want to, but they've mislabeled it. But labeling is very important. You know that in Europe there is the revolution of labeling. Slowly Europe is labeling everything. Consumers want more and more transparency. They want to know more about where things come from. So there is a collective effort to give consumers a label which will make it possible for them to be protected. We're working, for instance, with the new European directive, which will have a common label for all the labels in Europe. Says that it must be readable, it must be of a certain size, it must be simple, because we can't expect consumers to read the very complicated things. So Europe is trying through labels to give the very clear and simple information, but it's very slow. And here in Italy, in fact, it'll increase defense, but very often there are other countries that don't want to follow the new label regulations. To betray the label means to betray the consumer, because if you mislabel the fish, labeling it as if it were another species, is like betraying the consumers. For example, a fraud of this type can switch from a marketing to a health fraud. For example, I'm going to sell catfish instead of Vietnamese catfish instead of a more precious fish, but instead of selling something which is for example, from the Mediterranean, something which comes from Asia. Don't forget Fukushima and the type of contamination that you can have in Asia. The correct labeling of fish is essential for health too. The example that or the story that we had this spring was linked to lasagne. In the UK, they discovered that for years they'd eaten lasagne, which were not beef but contained horse meat, and that made them jump out of their socks because they would never eat horse, and the thought that it was really trauma for them. But that also led to the crisis because lasagne not only were the massive production where it said beef and it had horse meat. And throughout Europe, we started with a emergency plan to monitor it. And we saw that lasagna contained a lot of horse meat. In Italy, a lot of people eat horse meat. We know that the meat has it's very thin, it's very good for a diet, and so we were certainly not surprised. But in other countries, the replacement and mislabeling really affected people. But then if we go beyond this, it's not to be disregarded. These horses were mostly horses that had been slaughtered in Romania. Now, you know that there are two different types of horses. They're the ones that are racing horses that it can receive drugs, and you can give them drugs. But then the horses that are for horse meat have a separate career, so to speak. Veterinary surgeons have to check that they should not be given drugs and so on and so forth. So the horses, the racing horses, must not end up in the slaughterhouse. What happened that in particular in Romania, in these countries where they were slaughtered for these lasagne, clearly some of the older racing horses were also taken to the slaughterhouse. Why? Well, because at the beginning of the alarm, they saw that there was a presence of phenylbutazone, which is an anti-inflammatory given to racing horses. It's banned for human beings. You can't give it to beef that then's going to be slaughtered, but you can give it to a racing horse. It's very dangerous for human beings, for human consumption. So the risk of a replacement of a species, because I had horses, I didn't know what to do with them, can become, as it did become, a risk because it's unacceptable for people to eat for years anti-inflammatory drugs without being aware of it. So the marketing fraud and this replacement of species and mislabeling is not trivial because it might generate a risk for health. We, for example, found a large production of the opposite. For example, we had a mix of pork and chicken sold as horse meat. Why is the risk? Well, because virtually raw horse meat has no risks. But if you eat raw chicken or raw pork, it can be dangerous because of the presence of salmonella, and it's a risk for health. So that is why we cook chicken. So if you're taking one species thinking that it's another one might expose you to a risk that you would not consider. Furthermore, for example, people were buying horse meat because they wanted a particular diet, and in fact they'd bought chicken for years, probably, and then obviously clearly the courts or the investigating magistrates had discovered that it had been stocked for years during the bird flu. That was when consumption dropped and it had to be recycled. And so it was old chicken meat. This is to focus your attention on the importance of giving the correct information, and that it is unacceptable that one species should be mislabeled and sold as something else. And to complete this, in Italy we've had various cases of horse meat lasagne, clearly. You know what happens then? The batch can't be sold, and there were arrests and so on. But we've never found anti-inflammatories in them. Another thing, which is very important and which refers to the identification of species which are, in quote, unlawed, because the financial and economic crisis has led to fraud and mislabeling, as I mentioned earlier on. So, for example, we have had to introduce a system which is a bit like the CSI of foodstuff. That is to say, we identify the DNA of the animal species that we're monitoring. This is the trend that we see, and here you can see where it's the dark blue in the bar chart. It means that they're inconsistent. That is to say, they don't correspond to the species that they were labeled as. This is extremely important, especially to understand where this foodstuff comes from. And this is something that we will have to do for all food. This is something that we want to do. We want to know name and surname of what we have on our table. Another point which we've been studying, because it appears to be really impossible, but it is true that there was no scientific method to tell fresh fish from frozen fish. Why is it so important? Because the fraud is that they can mislabel it. They tell us it's fresh while it's not true, and that's. But even worse is the opposite dangerous. That is to say, when we're sold fish that is fresh and supposed to be eaten raw, sushi bars or whatever we buy, like carpaccio, which has not been frozen at minus 20 degrees for 24 hours or 35 degrees centigrade for 15 hours, and all fresh fish must have undergone this treatment. Why? To avoid the risk of parasites. Because parasites, fish parasites, have increased. They're increasing everywhere because of global warming. We see that there has been an increase of the presence of parasites in, for example, lake or freshwater fish, and because globalization and the fact that we get fish from the world throughout leads to an increase in spread of these parasites. The risk, for example, of anisakis, I'll show it to you. Here it is a risk that is on the rise, because one of the carriers, and it's dangerous for human beings, is dolphin. Because this is on the rise in Italy, that is to say, we're having an increase of the number of beached animals, and since we have Liguria and Genoa and Imperia, I think that we will become the national center of reference. But these animals are rightly protected, and they're growing in numbers, and they are a vehicle of parasites, of anisakis. Now, we absorb it because I'm talking, for example, both about the fish, but also, say, the calamaris and others. Here you see it's in the abdominal cavity of the animal. If you gut the fish immediately, then nothing happens. But if you don't do that, the nematode migrates to the rest of the fish, and the risk is quite a substantial risk for your health. Also because there is not yet, it's growing, but there's not yet a widespread culture whereby in a hospital people also consider, with the given symptoms, that the person is suffering because of the presence of anisakis, of parasites. If diagnosed, these illnesses can be easily cured, but if not, they can lead to major problems. Another problem, let's leave the name because it's Opistorchis. Opistorchis, I put a Russian there in the picture because it's present in the whole of Eastern Europe. There's a very large number. It affects 1.7 million people in Eastern Europe because it's a parasite that uses the cat and dog, especially cat, as a vehicle of which transmitted to it, but as a host, freshwater fish. It's a parasitosis which is dramatic, which causes fatal diseases in Eastern Europe. With the fashion now of changing our food habits and with the arrival, with the new passion that we have for raw fish, we are open to risks of parasites which we would not have if we ate it cooked. We have had one case that in the course of a fair, for example, 70 people who suffered from osteoarthritis, and they took them days to diagnose them, and some had major problems with their liver because they'd eaten some raw fish from a lake in central Italy where the disease is rampant. These are the checks that we carried out. 1 minute? Yes. Otherwise, we haven't got those 3 minutes for the question. Here you see we then have chemical contamination. We mentioned it, dioxin, heavy metals, and so on, so forth. Anything that we go, we can't imagine that we have a sick environment and which produces healthy food. All the industrial discharges, the refuse that we burn comes back to us through fruit and vegetable. It comes back like a poisoned apple. And this is what we have to remember, that the environment has been forgotten, but we will have to look after it because all the things that that are bad for the environment go back into the food chain. Think of cesium, for example, from Chernobyl. We've carried out a number of checks on wild boar, and we still find cesium from the Chernobyl accident, and there's an increased number of people who are eating wild boar, and those are the mozzarellas. And another thing that I would say, because it's allergies, food allergies, 2% of the Italian population, for example, suffers, 8% of all children suffer from food allergies. These are the main causes. And there are increasing and new ones that are found in Piedmont. This is the last thing. We're the first region that has been carrying out monitoring. We're always the first. I'm very proud of that. As the first region that has carried out monitoring on the presence of allergens in foodstuff that declared that they had nothing that could cause allergies. And we've seen that the 3 labels out of 100 are not complete. For example, they don't say what they've got. They say they don't say that this got casein or something else while we found it. And with this, I would like to conclude in saying that the cutting back of resources for prevention may lead to major risks. So the shutdown, for example, in the US will not completely close food monitoring, but it will the problems will increase because damages at that point are really out of control. These are parasites in salmon. We have to invest in food safety because in this way we will be defending our health, but we will also be defending, as I said, our treasure, food. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Siamo nei tempi e abbiamo 5 minuti per le domande.
We've got 5 minutes now for questions. So there's a roaming mic. If Venice has any questions, please tell us. We'll be very pleased to answer. Here's the mic. What about this European label? When will it be ready? Well, the law harmonizing labels is 2 years old, but it gives each country time according to the objective. For example, as far as allergens are concerned, it's a bit later. Some things were immediately implemented, others require time. For example, if you want to know what allergens are present, because there was rather a nebulous sentence, can be processed in plants that have also treated. Well, no, you have to give very clear and immediate information. Good evening. I would like to ask a question as far as the animals are concerned. Over the past 4 or 5 years, in many gardens in Turin, we've seen that there's been a large number of squirrels, European and American squirrels. So my question is, do you think that they might bear or have diseases? Yes, that's very interesting because it adds to what was said on the spread of animals that previously were absent, and also the fact that wild animals are coming closer and closer to human beings. We see it at the Valentino Park, very beautiful. There are squirrels that are fearless and come close to us. Wild boar, foxes, animals that previously were not in direct contact with the city, and that inevitably, it couldn't be otherwise, create a new risk which is linked to the spread of diseases. As far as the squirrels are concerned, there's no immediate alarm as far as human health is concerned, but there is a risk which is linked to the fact that they might pass diseases on. For example, the gray squirrel is prevailing. It's the bigger one. It's the American one, which is fearless, and it's overrun our red squirrels. They're very, very nice, very pretty, but very invasive. Biodiversity in this case is severely threatened. Thank you very much, Professor Caramelli. Thank you all.